Hey friends, and welcome back to the channel. Super stoked for this discussion we're about to have here. With me as a guest is my good friend Peter Koo. We've been friends for a while now and had lots of fun conversations related to Christianity and apologetics and engaging other cultures with grace and truth for some time now. And so it was just a matter of time before I got you on here and we started talking about this for you guys all to hear and be a part of. So thanks for coming, Peter. Super stoked for our discussion.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so really excited. So let's kind of just start unpacking a little bit about you and how you've developed through the years in asking questions and seeking truth, and then we'll kind of dive into some more of the arguments and culture stuff in a minute. So tell me a little bit about your story, how you started asking big questions, maybe wrestling through doubts and seeking truth related to faith.
Yeah, so my parents were both Christians, so growing up being at church and hearing about, different things in Christianity and especially who Jesus was and what he did, what that was a big part of growing up for me. And so I remember believing as a kid in God. And the first kind of critical question that I can remember asking was wondering, how do I know that I believe in the right God? And it's interesting because as a kid, I was confident that God did exist, but I wanted to make sure that I believed in the right God. And yeah, frankly, I don't really remember how that ended up getting resolved, but I just remember that was kind of a passing question that I had as a kid. And so as I got a little bit older, kind of entering into more of a critical thinking mindset and age, when I was about 12 and 13, that's when I had, at that point, I had committed to following Jesus. I had gotten baptized, and I was starting to process through some different questions, maybe a little bit more big picture questions. And so I remember just not being sure how to know for sure that God exists as a young teenager, and just trying to think about, how would I know? And I think I placed a lot of that in spiritual experience. And then I was wondering, okay, how do I know what is a spiritual experience? And so those were the questions that I began to think about when I was kind of entering that age. And so I think a lot of that was brought on just by the fact that in middle school we talked about current events. And so that's when I started to really think critically about all these different things. And so that included, my faith, things that I had committed to believing in. And I had good reasons to believe in, but that I hadn't really kind of critically analyzed.
Yeah. No, I relate to a lot of what you said, like growing up in a Christian home, and really from a young age having lots of the right beliefs, but having to figure out, do I just have this in my head and this knowledge just because it's what I grew up in, or have I really kind of believed it for myself and taken it on for myself, and then even starting to wrestle with doubts. It's like, why do I believe that God exists, and why do I believe that all my sins are forgiven in Jesus and Jesus is alone? Just some questions I started having to wrestle through and just think through as faith became more of something that I actually needed to think about as related to my life versus just something that we did as a family. So I relate to a lot of that. I think we'll unpack that a little more in this next question. I know that for me, I started having specific questions that were a little more meaningful to me, or at least a little more pressing than other questions. So I'm curious for you, in your experience, were there questions that earlier on were a little more pressing? Maybe there were certain doubts you had to face or wrestle with. Were some of the more questions that were more interesting to you or more meaningful to you earlier on?
Yeah, I think so. That reminds me of this clip that I saw, and unfortunately I don't remember his name, but there's this Christian comedian, and he was describing his experience being an atheist and talking to a Christian, and the Christian was talking to him, I think, about God, and he said something like, "Oh yeah, I'm an atheist. I don't believe that stuff." And then the Christian's talking to him about, I think it was the Bible he was talking to him about. And he said, "Oh yeah, but I've never read the Bible." And then the guy said to him something like, "You're not an atheist, you're a moron." And so he was like taken aback. It's like, "Why'd you call me a moron?" It's because he didn't look into it. And so I think I kind of realized.
Yeah.
And then what he said after that was, if you were a true atheist, you would have actually looked at different religions and decided that they're all false. But he just hadn't kind of done the work. And so when I was in that similar age as I was talking about as a young teenager, I think I realized that I hadn't had my belief system challenged yet. And so that comes with some fears. And I think that's a universal thing for everyone. You know,
Yeah.
growing up, we have a way that we see the world.
Sure.
It's informed by our parents and our teachers,
Sure.
and we trust it because we're kids. And so hearing that question of, well, you just believe, or that suggestion, you just believe that because that's what your parents believed. You know, that's why you're a Christian, is
Mm.
because your parents are Christians.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's kind of just how it works, right? And
Mm.
so what we need to do to go from there is to consider, you know, what are the other options? How do I see the world? Can I honestly keep this faith that I've had growing up? And
Mm.
so I think that question of just kind of responsibility, needing to look into things to see, oh, there's more out there that people believe than just what I believe.
Mm.
And so I need to kind of know a little bit more why, not
Mm.
just kind of have a pure raw faith that I had as a child, which I don't think is a bad thing, for sure. It's
Sure.
a very good thing. But um, as we grow, then we can grow in multiple ways. So
Yeah.
yeah,
No, I relate to that, and I think it's healthy to start asking questions and have those doubts, like you said. Like, yeah, we just start figuring that out in our own heads, and I relate to that a lot too. Of you kind of go unchallenged for a while, and then when the challenges start happening, like it can get a little bit scary. It's like, well, I've kind of assumed this my whole life, or I've lived in this way my whole life, but it's like, is this actually like real? I think that's natural and probably the experience of a lot of people who grew up in Christian homes. Um, so I actually think that yeah, asking questions is super healthy, and I think it's something that all of us are gonna have to face at some point. We're gonna seek the reason for this faith that we kind of grew up in. I relate to that. I mean, growing up, I grew up in Europe where it's very post Christian. But even still, for a long time, like growing up was like, this is what my family believes, like this is true, and even a certain amount of experience kind of went along with that. But then growing up and like starting to be more challenged by friends and acquaintances growing up of asking questions, being very skeptical, it started making me think like, okay, is this actually true? Like, is this something that I want to hold to? And as I develop into an adult and have more mature and thought through opinions and beliefs on stuff, is this something I can hold to? Or as I'm mature, am I kind of, grow out of it? So that's why I started getting into apologetics and seeing, is what my family believes actually true? Is this something that I can actually talk to with my unbelieving friends in an intellectual way? And that was actually really stimulating for me. Being on YouTube and seeing apologists, Christians talk about their faith in an intellectual way that I'd personally never really heard before. So that was just kind of groundbreaking for me, and I was hooked on apologetics. I couldn't get enough of it. Um, and I remember arguments that were really strong for me and that kind of sealed the deal. I was like, okay, this is true. But I'm curious for you, were there any such arguments that were stronger in your opinion, or that really, as you started asking these questions and seeking answers, were there any that were more meaningful to you?
yeah, that's a good question. I think for I can only speak for myself, but I've heard that for a lot of people, it's it's not as much that the arguments actually bring us into faith, into trusting God, as much as it's that they're giving us good reason to do so. You know, to
Mm-hmm.
see that it makes sense. It's
Right.
consistent. We don't have to kind of throw our brain in the trash,
Right.
right? To choose faith, to choose
Yeah.
Jesus. And I found that was the same for me, that the arguments were really helpful as I would want to have coherence in the things that I believed
Mm-hmm.
with what I saw in the world. And so with that, I think the most powerful argument for God's existence as a kind of go-to for that role, faith-seeking understanding,
Yeah.
is the cosmological argument, or
Mm-hmm.
different kinds of cosmological arguments. Um, yeah, I guess Thomas Aquinas's kind of uh, readjustment of Aristotle's unmoved mover argument is really powerful to
Yeah.
me. Just that we, no matter, here in this room, listening online, we're all sitting in a room, we're all somewhere outside, there's stuff around us. And the question is, where did that come from?
Yeah.
There is a beginning of the universe, the scientific consensus says there's a beginning of the universe. And the question
Mm.
is, why did we get here? How did we get here?
Mm.
And I think just from looking into that question a little bit more, and wondering what are some good explanations for that,
Mm.
I don't think there's a better explanation than that there is a rock who's more ancient than time. There's a
Mm.
beginning of time. And so the question is, how does that even happen?
Mm.
What does that even mean?
Hmm.
That there's, yeah, so the idea that God is, he's an unstoppable force and an immovable object.
Yeah.
He's the thing.
Hmm.
He's explaining everything in the universe.
Hmm.
And so I think that really makes a lot of sense to me. I think that it would be, um, yeah, it would be difficult to come up with an alternative for that. And I think that's what a lot of people do, is just say, well, I guess we don't know. And so you kind of have to be okay with not knowing, I guess.
Yeah, sure. I agree. That was one of the arguments that was the most impactful for me as I started seeking answers, because it was just highly conversational. I feel like you can get very scientific as you dive into it, but like even like you explained, like it can be so just rational and reasonable that the universe had a beginning. Where did it come from? Where did all this stuff come from? And that's a question that I would start asking my friends when I was a kid, starting to learn apologetics. Was like, well, hold on. Even if you believe in the Big Bang, what caused it? Like, you can't ever get past that point without some sort of cause outside the universe. So even if you believe in all the scientific processes or theories from that point on, Big Bang, evolution, you name whatever it is, you can never get past that point. You still need something beyond the universe to start it all. Um, so that was just a really easy way for me to start talking about my faith in God and how even contemporary science seemed to be pointing towards that. So I agree. That was a really cool one. Another one that I liked a lot was the fine tuning of the universe.
Yeah.
Part of it, honestly, was because it had lots of big words that I was learning to use, and that
Nice.
felt kind of fun. Not gonna lie,
Yeah.
talking about like the fact that Earth is like rotating perfect amount of speed. If we're going any faster, we can live on the Earth. If we're going any
Mm.
slower, we can live on the Earth. The strength of gravity, the existence of the planet Jupiter, the speed of light, all these things lined up just right, making life possible. And if
Mm.
just one of them was off, that we couldn't be here. And it's kind of spooky.
Yeah.
It's like the whole universe was set up in just the right way that life is possible. Like it knew we were coming, and that's kind of spooky. Like there's something going on out there. And that was one that I kind of liked a lot. Between that and then the origin of the universe, it's like, well, the start of the universe looks like there's a God. The kind of universe that was created looks like there's a God. So those were just really interesting arguments for me growing up that were really convincing. But I do agree with what you said at the very beginning. That very rarely do we come to faith simply by arguments, because there's that high. We're very volitional. You
Mhm.
have to actually surrender to it, and arguments can never overpower your will.
Yeah, totally.
They're a good tool. They might help take away stuff that's keeping you from faith, and they might help embolden you in your faith. But I like how you put that faith-seeking reason.
Mhm.
That so often they're a help, but there's just a lot more that goes on than just rationality. Like we're not merely rational creatures, and we all know that from our experience. We're emotional.
Yeah.
We have all these other components. So while it's a good tool and it might even be essential in cases, it's not the whole deal. So
Yeah.
I agree with that. I think that helps a lot.
And something that I've realized too recently is that we are able to hold contradictions, and that's actually a good thing
Mm,
for us to do, because oftentimes those contradictions help us to be more good. And
mm,
so, for example, if you take a lot of people will look at the moral argument for God's existence, say, there's no way that there can be moral facts and duties if God doesn't exist. And some people, and suppose just hypothetically, that argument is actually sound. And so
mm,
it's true. It's that God must exist if we have moral values and duties. But would you rather someone be consistent with that and say, I don't believe in God, so I don't believe in morality,
mm.
or be inconsistent?
Yeah.
Be inconsistent to be better. And so I think it's actually it's a bit mysterious, where we have this recognition that so many of the things that we're trying
Mm,
to learn more about, they're actually so that we can position ourselves in the world in a certain way. That we
mm.
want to be good, we want to be
Yeah.
responsible, and so we're trying to figure out how to do that.
Yeah.
As a one of our professors said, that ethics is the aim and end of philosophy.
Mm,
And so
mm,
even that itself kind of points to God's existence. Like, why
mm,
is it that the way that we live matters so much? Not
mm.
just in the sense of, society or pressure, but that it really matters to us, the way
Yeah.
that we live,
It's
having
true.
integrity, having honesty, um, that we need to situate ourselves in a certain way. And so sometimes it can be really uncomfortable,
Mm,
but just going back to what you're saying about the arguments, even if we're proven wrong, we're there are times when we just have to be okay with that. We just
mm,
have to be okay with not totally getting rid of our worldview and totally shifting our understanding of the worlds, because we have to be a little bit more cautious with it.
It's true, and no one has their whole worldview figured out. I think like doubts arise, but with everything that comes up and questions we have, we're gonna be very unstable if we just let that be the whole picture. Like with everything that comes up, we need the backdrop of reality of what we do know. We have good reason to believe. So like even when we have doubts or questions that come up, we need as we face that, and it's okay to not even find a question. There's some find an answer. There's some questions that we can't find an answer, at least not easily.
Yeah.
But when we have a backdrop of what else we have good reason to believe, it just gives us more peace and patience, even if we don't find the answer to that. So that's something that's helped me a lot. But I do find that really interesting what you're saying, that as human beings, like we are drawn to goodness. Like there's certain things that we want and pursue. Like we're drawn to goodness. We do seek truth, and we are drawn to beauty. And I think that's actually an interesting place in apologetics that I think maybe could be expounded upon, is like, what are things that humans universally desire and seek, and what does that say about us, and what best explains that? What worldview best explains humans being drawn to goodness, and wanting to create beauty? Because I don't think a merely materialistic and naturalistic worldview can explain those things very well, at least. But so that's actually the next thing we're going to talk about. I'm curious if there are any arguments that you'd like to see developed more, expounded upon, or at least given more attention to, that you think have potential or would be interesting for you to see more from.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely have to take the angle of what I think would be cool if people talked about more, because I'm no one to be talking about the bounds of these arguments on the philosophical level. But something that I was thinking a little bit about this, and one concept that I think is maybe it's just that I wasn't aware of it. It wasn't really as much in my circle, that I'm kind of processing through how to discuss it.
Hmm.
Is the way that we all have the same evidence that we're looking at, but we perceive it so differently. And so maybe kind of just taking a step back from the argumentation and kind of considering worldviews in general. And so, yeah, why is it that for, say, a Christian who believes that God created everything, that we look at the world around us and can literally see evidence for God's existence everywhere that we look? Everything that we have, the material things, they've all been made by God. They all come from somewhere. And so, but for an atheist, it's not evidence at all for God's existence. So maybe this is the kind of divine hiddenness concept, and it kind of engages with the concept of what is an act of God. And a lot of times people might think of a miracle, and so they might think, I have to see something that normally doesn't happen in order to actually believe in God. Something that defies the laws of nature. Hume said essentially that. But the problem with that is that we will often have things in our lives that are difficult to attribute to coincidence, even though they don't actually violate a law of nature. And so this is another example of something that for a Christian, it would be like an act of God. And for an atheist, it would have to be just a coincidence. And so hypothetically, this hasn't happened to me, but hypothetically, if there was someone who is dying of starvation out in the forest, and then an animal came and gave him a bunch of food, then that wouldn't violate a law of nature. Then the animal's able to pick it up, he's able to go give it to him. But a Christian would probably see that as, wow, God is actually saving this person's life. God is actually providing for them through the material world.
Yeah.
But then an atheist would have to come up with a different explanation if that were to happen. And so just kind of thinking about that, it kind of points to there's a lot more going on than just the evidence. There has to be, because we're all looking at the evidence and we're all coming to different conclusions.
Yeah.
And so kind of getting into that that type of conversation, I think, is something that I want to be learning more about and doing more with people, because it's very real. You know, we all have our different experiences, different ways that we perceive the information that we're all seeing. But our perception is a factor. And so, yeah, kind of getting into that, I guess, miracles, acts of God. Um, how can we trust that God exists? Divine revelation. I
Mm,
think those concepts would be interesting to talk about more, just because of that concept of contradiction that I mentioned earlier.
mm,
Like, hypothetically, say there's a perfect argument for God's existence. Um, I think some of these arguments do work, the cosmological, the
sure.
moral, but it's kind of like, if it doesn't, they have a purpose, right? They're
Absolutely.
meant to be showing us that there is a God and that we can
Mm,
actually orient ourselves in relation to him. It's not just a fact in our mind, it's actually
mm,
about our life. And
yeah.
so, yeah, I think maybe having a little bit more of that type of big picture worldview conversation
Yeah.
could help us kind of reflect a little bit more on our lives in general as people.
Yeah, I think that's actually really helpful. And I think that as you were saying that, something that was just coming to mind is just that worldview isn't just like what we're getting back from something or even the conclusions we draw based on what we see. But worldview is also in a very real way the glasses we look through, which affects the way that we see things. Like you said, two people can be seeing the exact same thing, but they might perceive something very different. And I think we see that in the real world that someone can look at the world and be like, how can you not believe in God? There's evidence for him everywhere. Like you see it everywhere. But maybe an atheist will look at the world and be like, how can you believe in God? Like there's no evidence of him anywhere. Um, I think part of that is the worldview.
Yeah,
When I look at things, I do see God and evidence for him everywhere because I understand certain things related to his provision, even like what you just said, the example you gave of him providing through the world he's made.
yeah,
And to be clear, like that's completely possible. Like even in human terms, you wouldn't disbelieve in that I have an uncle that exists if he doesn't come to my birthday party and give me a gift. If instead his company that he's created ships me a package of such and such an item.
sure.
Like he's created that, and that just as well would prove that he exists. Just because he's not right there, you'd still believe he exists if his company sent me something. In the same way, God can use the world that he's made
Hmm.
to answer prayer requests and needs. So at least that works. Um, but on the other side, like an atheist in their worldview would perceive things very differently in understanding things to work from a purely materialistic and naturalistic mindset. They're going to say like, oh, but this can all be explained because of this. Therefore, God's not in the picture. So worldviews do affect how we perceive things. So I think that was just a helpful thing that you discussed from that. Uh, but I agree. I think there are interesting conversations to be had related to apologetics that I'd like to see more from. I think part of it is human nature. That's something that I want to read more on and do more work on in the future of diving into human nature and what worldview best explains that. Because a
Yeah,
worldview is like a meta narrative. It gives us a story that we live inside of. But even like we mentioned earlier, humans universally want certain things and pursue certain things and seek certain things. Which of these grand stories best explains that if we're characters in the middle?
right.
I think there should be something that can explain that. Like humans that live as an accident and they've developed through processes and ultimately aren't going anywhere. I think that's a very different story from humans that have been created on purpose, for a purpose, with purpose by an intentional God to live in relationship with Him and other people and to be eternal beings, even beyond the grave. I think that's a very different story. I think the way we live our lives and certain things you learn about what it means to be human and how we live and things we want and pursue, I think that should say something about the kind of story that we're actually living in.
Hmm.
Because even when we find contradictions, and I think that's a helpful thing that you've been talking about. It's cool to see like universal things that humans pursue.
Yeah,
So I'd like to see more work done on that, related to humans pursuing relationship and pursuing meaning and purpose, and this universal fear of death. No one
yeah,
wants to die, but if it's just been a natural part from the very beginning that to have life means to die, why is this their universal concern for death?
mm,
I think that could be an interesting discussion to have related to apologetics. Because for the Christian, it's because death wasn't designed. We
yeah,
weren't designed to die. We were created to live forever with a perfect God. And death is part of the curse of our fallen nature and
right.
living apart from God's perfect design. So, anyways, yeah, I think that would be fun to see more work done on.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think there are lots of fun conversations that can be had related to apologetics. And like we've said, apologetics isn't the whole deal. Like there's a lot more to be had, you know. I think there's also room for counseling and friendship and other conversations with other people. But to kind of bring what we've talked about together, what do you think is the role of apologetics in relationships and conversations with people in your life who aren't believers?
Yeah, for sure. That's a really good question. I think that there are a couple things that are for sure more important than apologetics.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in general, when we're talking about sharing about the Lord with other people, Jesus says that the world will know that you're my disciples by your love for one another.
Mm.
And so that's the thing that Jesus says, that's how people are going to know that we follow him. And so if the world doesn't see that, if people in our lives don't see that, then how can we expect them to actually come to the Lord? You know, having the best arguments, having the best presentation, if it has no errors in it, that's not going to mean anything. As Paul says in 1 Corinthians, if we don't have love, we're nothing. And so that's the most important thing. And at the end of the day, that's what the Lord asks of us, right? To love him and to love other people. It's the greatest commandment.
Yeah.
And so that's the most important thing. And then I think processing through a little bit about worldview stuff, apologetics and maybe philosophy in general, the way that I see it mostly is that it has a bit of a reactive role in these type of journeys that we have, that people are going on. It's kind of like the arguments isn't really the thing. It's kind of like the world that we're living in is the thing, the narrative, like what you were talking about. And so more than like not only coming to true facts, we don't care just about things that being true, because there are a lot of things that we don't care about that are true. And so whether, you know, there's an ant that is in this building or not, that has a truth value to it, but it doesn't really matter to us. It doesn't really do anything to our lives, whether it's true or not. And so people need to see from God that actually these questions, these actually impact our lives, that there's a reason why we actually should want Christianity to be true.
Yeah.
And so that's where I think a big part of the love comes in. That's so powerful. That's the work of God, that we get to actually express his love to other people. And then so everything else is kind of in that context. That's kind of the way that I see it. And with that said, the intellectual barriers that we have can be really powerful. You know, they're limiting for us. One of the reasons that I couldn't be an atheist is that I believe in God. And so if I were to become an atheist, one of the things that would need to happen is I would actually need to be convinced intellectually that God doesn't exist. And so that would have to happen at some point. You know what I mean? So regardless of how major a role that is, that would be in my specific journey. And so I think that it's very reasonable for us, we're intellectual people. It's very reasonable for people that we know that don't believe in God to have questions. Yeah. And actually a lot of those questions, they actually have assumptions that are true assumptions.
It's true.
They ask questions, they might say things like, I don't want to believe in a God who does this. Well, technically, God, whether he exists or not, doesn't really depend on, you know, what we want him to be like.
Yeah.
But the way that they're thinking actually makes sense. They're thinking God is perfection. Well, why are you thinking that way? And so if we can show people that actually it's consistent with the way that God is, who God is, for him to work in a certain way, for him to do certain things, then that's helpful for people. So I think that if we don't have any answers for people, then that's also it's good for us to get them. And the way that Peter describes it is to be prepared to give an answer for the hope that you have, essentially when people ask you. And so that's the other really important thing in our lives, that we have people that we already know, our friends and family members, but then there's kind of that assumption in that statement, and that command to be prepared. The assumption is that people are actually going to be looking at Christians and seeing that they have a ton of hope in their lives, that their lives are actually different, their lives are very good, and that people are going to be asking them about it and wanting that. And so I think that apologetics flows downstream of that love that we have for people and the hope that we have, people looking at us and actually thinking, you know, that thing that you have, I actually want that. Because even if they hear the best arguments, if they think, you know what, why should I give up what I have? And they don't have a good reason, then that's kind of more fundamental, you know. It's just all a fun exercise at that point.
Yeah. And I love the way you described that. All of us know a guy, even if it's not related to faith, someone who just argues their point. Maybe it's related to politics, maybe certain social issues, maybe faith. But they argue their faith, and maybe they're even persuasive in the way they argue it. But you look at the way that they do that, or the way they treat people, and you decide you want no part of it. I think you made a really good point that apologetics isn't just about what you say or even the kind of arguments you give. You know, that's part of it, but a lot of it is the kind of life you're living. Like you said, that verse from 1 Peter 3:15, always be prepared to give the reason for the hope that is within you when people ask. So we do have hope. It is something that's not just true that we're arguing for, but something that's real, that is shaping our life and changing us and helping us to love people better. Like we talked about earlier, we are called to love God and to love people. And if you're just trying to argue with people outside of context of love, not only is it meaningless, but it's actually setting up obstacles to the gospel, which is what a sad thing that is, that if something's keeping, I would hate to be the thing that's keeping someone from the gospel or the way I do something. And in fact, that's something Paul wrote about. Even if we speak in the tongues of angels but have not love, it means nothing.
Yeah.
So love is really crucial, and that's the end of that verse. It's in 1 Peter 3:15 says, "But do so with gentleness and respect."
Yeah.
So whenever we're doing this, it's not about debating. Apologetics means giving the reasons for what we believe. So it's not even necessarily about fighting, which we can sometimes imagine. But we need to do this with gentleness and respect. It is more of a personal issue, at least in our cultural context here in the West. People don't always talk about what they believe or deeper matters.
Right.
So we want to be gentle with them and be respectful of them, knowing that you're not going to persuade anyone if you're being rough or rude, but also that it is transformative. It is hopeful. It's not just trying to win an argument, but there's something that's taking place in our lives and our hearts that we want to genuinely share with them because we care about them. And we can't lose that heart by getting into just all the debate and all the work of it. So I really like how just you unpacked that, that the way we live is also an apologetic, not just what we say. And sometimes that'll be the most real thing they say. Because I've experienced people say, you know, I have all the knowledge and I know to some extent that this is true, but I just have a hard time understanding that it's real. And it's kind of like that thing you said, like if there's an ant in this building, like, you know, sure, that might be true, but like that doesn't feel very meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the same about apologetics, honestly. The arguments, like I can hear these arguments that, okay, there's good reason to believe that God exists, and that's true, but what does that mean for me? Why should I care? Like I don't feel like he's real, or I don't experience that. And when someone sees God alive within you, by the way you treat me and love me and what you're saying to me, I think that's one way that people can get that sense of the reality of something, not just the truth of it.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. Of course, if something is true, then it's real. And if it's real, then it's true. But I think as humans experience things, we have a lot of things that we believe is true, but don't really live transformed by them because we don't feel that they're real. Mm-hmm. So that's actually the next question, because I think that's something that comes up in circles where people grow up in the church, like you and I, but maybe haven't necessarily had the time or space to ask these questions or wrestle with their doubts and maybe make their faith their own. They might say, you know, I have all the head knowledge. I understand the gospel. I've heard the arguments from a young age, and you know, I know this stuff is true, but I just have a hard time feeling it's real. Like, where is God? And in a sense, how can I surrender my life to someone that I don't even know? Like, maybe God's out there, but I don't know him. So how could I surrender my life to him? What would you say to someone like that who says, you know, I believe this is true, but I just don't feel it's real. So how can I surrender my life?
That's a really interesting concept. And I like what you mentioned with the true versus real thing. Obviously, so much overlap.
Right.
But I realized recently that some things can feel real to us in a different way. It's like beauty and goodness, those are also a kind of reality making thing for us that we see and we perceive, okay, this is real. And so I think, yeah, what the first thing that I would say, I guess, for someone who it sounds like this person is actually intellectually committed to the Christian faith, which is great. I guess what I would say then after that is that what we were talking about before, the importance of how we situate ourselves is not just for is not just for non-Christians. It's for everyone. And so we can do ourselves a huge favor by situating ourselves in a way that's oriented towards God. And so some of the ways that we can do that are through prayer and reading scripture and by going to church. I think those are all really great things that we can actually implement in our life to kind of say, put our money where our mouth is. Like, if I'm really committed to this, then it's going to be, I'm going to act accordingly,
Yeah.
And so even if I don't feel like it. And so the other concept there is that just because our emotions are a certain way doesn't mean that has to be defining us. And so when we think about our relationships with other people, I might be mad at my brother, but that doesn't mean that I don't treat him kindly. And so in an example like that, or say, maybe an easy example is if you're married and you have a spouse, love isn't just the nice feeling that we have or the affection, but it's also the service. It's also all the other things that we do, maybe, and even especially when we don't feel like it. And so definitely we can feel free to pray to God, to actually ask him for things.
Yeah.
And he wants us to find him. Jesus says, ask and you will receive, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be open to you. And so he does care about us believing in him and having confidence in him. And he actually makes that something that we can grow in over time. But at the same time, even if we don't have it, he also says, blessed are those who do not see and yet believe. Yeah. And so if we're committed to that, then that's actually a really blessed place to be. And so definitely kind of just move forward when we're in that type of situation.
Yeah.
I think many of us can say that we've been there, where we don't feel as maybe excited about things or about the world or things like that. But
That's true.
How we feel doesn't necessarily dictate the things that we do, the decisions we make. Yeah. And at the end of the day, what is love? It's not just the emotions, it's also how we live.
I think that's so good. Reality isn't determined by our feelings. In fact, if you've lived long enough, then you've probably had feelings that have led you down the wrong path.
Totally.
Towards something that is not real. And sometimes the most real things are the things that you don't feel, at least not immediately. Like I think about marriage. Like, I think that you might not always feel things, at least not deep things, until later on. Like, you might have these little feelings now and then, but I think about the richness of the feeling of a couple who's in their 70s. Like, what a rich and deep love they must feel. It must be very different from two 15-year-olds who have a fling. It's just completely different. There's something so much deeper there, something more real there. So I think sometimes the most real things are things that we don't feel immediately, and we know that feelings can lead us down the wrong road based on our experiences. So we can't give our feelings too much credit. And I feel where these people are coming from, that's hard to surrender to a God they feel like isn't present. But part of me wants to challenge this person, ask them, are you really seeking God? Because I've been in that spot. It's like, God, where are you? But we shouldn't question God when our Bibles are closed and our prayers consist of maybe thanking God for a meal, and we're not going to church. It's just hard to expect much from a God who's already sent his son to die for our sin and rise again, when we're not even trying to find him. He said that when you seek me with all your heart, then you will find me. It's not like he's out somewhere hiding, not wanting to be found, but he calls us each by name, and he wants us to come to him. So part of me just wants to say, seek God in his word, seek him in prayer and going to church, like you said, pursue those things. But the other part wants to say, you can't just find God by your own merit and your own attempts. Like, you also need that gift of grace, which, hey, that's the gospel. Like, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us, and God came to us to bring us to him. So there is that element as well. But I just want to say, yeah, to wrap this up, like you were saying, if there's good reason to believe this is true, then it is real too, and that's just kind of how reality works. Even if you don't automatically feel it, if this is true, if Jesus actually died and rose again, and there is good reason to believe that, um, that's enough to surrender to, even if you don't have the feelings. God's work in our life begins when we surrender it to Him. God can't save or surrender anything. God can't save or transform anything, that we don't surrender to Him. So part of it is that you just kind of got to take that step. And because He died and rose again, that means that He can take away my sin and He can raise me to new life with Himself. And that's what I want. So that's why I'm going to trust in Him and let Him start His work in my life as I surrender it to Him.
Is it okay if I add one more thing
Yeah,
as well?
of course.
Yeah, another I guess angle for this for someone who's processing through that, maybe questioning, wanting to have certain feelings, maybe is a little bit uncertain about what that looks like. It also says, Paul also teaches in Romans that we can look at the world around us and see God's presence there. And so I've been learning a little bit more about natural theology recently, and that's a really cool thing because it's totally independent of our feelings. And it's something that we can actually reflect on who God is according to Christianity and see, okay, does that cohere with the world that we see around us? So one of the coolest examples that I learned about was how in the beginning, when God created, if we think about it, who is God? He's not reliant on anyone. He doesn't have any needs. And so when He created, it wasn't like He needed to do it. He made a decision to do it, and He did so for love's sake, to perpetuate goodness and love. And so He creates for love's sake, and God actually built that truth about Himself into the universe, into our humanity. And so the only reason, there are of course, like, we are perverting the whole part of the gospel of the history of sin, is that we've perverted the good things that God has made. But so there's that perversion. But the natural design of God is that the way that there's life is through love. And so the reason that you and me are sitting here right now is because a man and a woman loved each other.
Yeah.
And that's a very real thing. It's a very tangible thing, not reliant on feelings.
It's true.
But we can see how that principle that's true about God has actually been built into the universe. And so that's another, potentially just an angle, someone who's considering, I'm struggling to really see God, to look into, is that the Bible says we can actually see God in the world around us.
Yeah.
And there's actually more than I initially thought that there would be. It's not just a sense of grandeur, which it definitely is.
Sure.
But there's a lot of God's fingerprint on how He's designed the universe.
I like that. I think that's so real because that's a real culture to speak to. Lots of people who've grown up in the church have those feelings. So I think that's really helpful. But other cultures that you and I have talked about throughout the years is that of Islam, the religion of Islam, and also Hindus. Though we've both gotten to make some friends and talk to people over the years and learn ways to share meaningfully with them what makes Christianity unique and just intentional questions to ask them. So as it relates to apologetics, maybe questions to ask or something that you like to point out. Let's start with Islam. What would you say to a friend who's Muslim? If you want to make an intentional point about the uniqueness of Christianity or ask an intentional question related to their own beliefs.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's a lot there for Islam. I think Islam has a lot of really how should I say it? There's a lot of commonality of common good things with Christians and Muslims. I think one of the best things about Islamic teaching is teaching the one God, teaching people to have reverence for Him, to really recognize who God is. That argument that we were talking about, the cosmological argument, that works in Islam as well. That's not just because that argument's true, then it's just Christianity only. That argument could also be used to defend Islam. And so there's this very high view of God. And so I think that's really good about Islam. And I guess that is what I would kind of look at, or that would be one of the things that I would look at when talking with a Muslim person. Having looked a little bit into Islam, I think the biggest challenge or the most difficult thing to rebut as a Muslim would probably be looking into the history and the Islamic dilemma. And so the rundown is kind of that the Quran teaches that God sent down the Torah and the Gospel and the Quran. And so it's like, cool, Allah sent down the Torah, the Gospel, and the Quran, and it's preaching a consistent revelation. And the Quran even says that Christians should actually follow the Gospel that they have. And the Gospel that they have, the book that they have, that's from, the Quran is written in the 700s AD. And so by that time, we can actually just look at history and see what book did the Christians have with them. We can look at manuscripts and say, okay, what did the manuscripts that teach about Christ, what did they say about him? And then compare those teachings with Islam. If the Quran is a valid revelation, then what should happen is they should be consistent with one another. The Torah, the Gospels, and the Quran.
Yeah.
And so looking at it, it seems pretty clear that there are some inconsistencies, and so there are a couple strategies that Muslims have to go to in order to reconcile that difficulty. And so looking at the historical data, I don't think those difficulties can be reconciled, and so I think that's the biggest problem for Islam. But so the historical side. Yeah. But going to a more theological point that was really interesting to me when I learned about it is going back to the commonality. Islam, belief in the one God, wanting to revere God. God is exalted above everything. I think Islam runs into a problem because in the Christian understanding of things, there's all of the superlatives, those are all had by God. The most wonderful works, the most wonderful heart, he's maximally good, he's maximally powerful, no one is greater than God. And I think that's the same thing in Islam. And in Islam, one of the main teachings about Allah is that he's the most merciful. And so it's a similar, that's also true of Christians, would also say that God is the most merciful. But there's a difficulty that comes into play, which is, how does God show his love? And so if God is the greatest person, the greatest being, then his acts of love should actually surpass all the acts of love that human beings can do, that the angels can do, because he's God, he's the greatest. But the problem is, in Islam, if Islam is true, then there's actually someone who did an act that was more loving than anything that God has ever done. And so that's a big problem with Islam. And that person would be Abraham. And it's because Abraham, he actually gave up his son for God. So he was actually willing to sacrifice something that was so important to him, the most precious person to him. He was willing to sacrifice his son for God. And so that act of love, we can contextualize that by maybe asking, well, why didn't God ask him to, give some of his cattle, or to give some of his, other possessions? Why did he ask him to give his son? It's like, no, because of course the whole point is that he wants Abraham to be showing his devotion to him, and that's actually the most devotion that he could have, is to sacrifice his son. And so, the story goes, God saves Abraham's son, and then that's all good. But then there's the problem, which is, okay, so what has God done that's loving? He's given us so many blessings, but he actually doesn't give anything up from it. But theoretically, him being God, all of our love comes from him. And so it's in his heart to love way more than it is in our heart to love. And so in the Christian story, God actually has that kind of love, and he actually does it. He actually gives up his son. He's willing for his son to be sacrificed because of love, because of his love for us. And that's the core Christian message. But I think that is a bit of a theological maybe puzzle for a Muslim, because it's clear that God is the most loving. There's no one greater than God. But in Islam, it seems like Abraham actually did something more loving than anything God's ever done.
I love that connection, that's what God did. He sent his son, Jesus, to live a perfect life and to die in our place as that sacrifice, and then to rise again. So that's really cool, just showing how in the Christian worldview that God is the most loving, and he's demonstrated that by his love being even greater than that of Abraham.
Yeah.
Instead of vice versa. So that's good. I also like the point you made about the manuscripts, because I know that's one of the most often things that a Muslim might bring up. Oh, your New Testament's been corrupted. That Jesus never claimed to be God. He never died and rose again. But what we find in the manuscript evidence is that our earliest manuscripts are the same gospels that we have today, that the message is the same. So we can't just say that's been corrupted to try to get out of it.
Right.
But that the earliest Christians, when these documents were written, had this same message. So that seems inescapable, and you need to address that at some point. Something that's really valuable, both those things, as one is trying to engage their Muslim friends. That's an intentional question you can ask them about God being the most loving and how he's more loving than Abraham, and how that connects to the gospel, but also just pointing out the manuscript. So that's helpful. And I'm sure we could have a whole discussion just on engaging Islam with truth and grace. But we're going to keep moving. So let's also talk about the Hindu worldview. We both got to talk to some Hindus and make some friends lately. So what are things that you've learned, maybe an intentional question to ask, something to point out, or maybe an apologetic argument that could be helpful?
Yeah, it seems like, in Hinduism is a lot more different from Christianity than Islam is. There's the polytheism, there's the there's the reincarnation, and so there are these kind of differences, but at the same time, it's actually consistent with the Christian worldview that God made us all in his image. And all people, no matter what religion they are actually made in his image. And we're brothers and sisters in humanity. And so I think it's cool to see that borne out even in religions and diverse cultures, is that we're going to have similarities.
Yeah.
And so seeing in Hinduism, there's a lot of value that's placed on prayer, a lot of value that's placed on honoring the gods.
Yeah.
And I think as a Hindu, I could be wrong about this, but I think that there's a lot of room for actually looking into Jesus, because he's a God who people believe in. And so for a Hindu, I would really encourage them to actually just take a lot more of a practical approach. Visit church, even start praying to Jesus, even start reading stories about him in the Bible. That, I think, that is a lot more acceptable for a Hindu than it would be for a Muslim. Sure. Because it's like, no, I can't do that. Sure. But for a Hindu, it's like, there are so many gods, I don't know about this god or that god. Sure. And so I would advise look into the teachings of Jesus and maybe consider, what does Jesus have to offer to me? Why should I follow him specifically? Because people, it's a religions thing, but it's also just in life, there are a lot of narratives, people always offering stuff saying, this is why you should go this way, this is why you should go that way. Yeah. And so Jesus promises us a lot. And so just looking into who is Jesus, what did he do, and actually even to start making Christian friends and praying to Jesus. Yeah. I think that'd be great. And then as a Christian also to be open and to be inviting to people who are Hindus to be able to kind of establish that relationship, because at the end of the day, those relationships are so great to form, no matter the outcome.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a really good point, that there's freedom for them to look and see, what does Jesus have to offer, what's different about him, or what's unique about him. And something that I've been learning, especially as we made Hindu friends, had lots of fun conversations, got to learn more about what they believe, is that a lot of what they do at their temples, and showing reverence for their various gods, is to escape the wrath of the gods, fearing that if they don't worship them, that they'll do something to them. They don't want that to happen. So it's fear-based in that sense. And then they also want to find favor from the gods, hoping that the gods will bless them or give them, whether that it be knowledge or wealth or success or a good marriage or whatever that is. So they're trying to escape the wrath of gods and find favor from the gods. But I'm not sure that their gods can truly do that very well, at least not as what we find in Christianity with Jesus. Because in the same way, in Christianity, we're trying to escape the wrath of God. We are under his wrath and judgment because we've rebelled against his perfect design. And that incurs judgment. Just as before any just judge, if there's a criminal, there has to be a payment for the crime. And God can't just snap his fingers and let us go. Otherwise, he wouldn't be a just judge. A human judge can't do that. So there needs to be payment for that crime. There's wrath that we want to escape. And we can't do that ourselves. A perfectly loving God might try to do that. A judge can pay the fine himself. And that's what God did through Jesus. He sent Jesus to live the perfect life we couldn't live and to die to pay the fine for our rebellion against him.
Yeah.
And then rise again, proving to be God, showing that the payment had cleared. That's something that none of the Hindu gods did. Shiva didn't do that. Vishnu didn't do that. In fact, lots of the Hindu gods are pretty messed up. Like, there are stories about them that aren't all that great. They're not really described as holy. I mean, Shiva is called the husband of animals. He's known for raping and having relationships with animals. He cut off the head of his own son, Ganesh, and then gave him an elephant head instead. And that's not me trying to take shots at the gods that people believe. Like, lots of them know these stories. If you're a Hindu, you know these stories. And all that tells you is that these gods aren't perfect. They're not holy. But the God of Christianity, Jesus, he is holy. There's a major point made on that. He's never done anything wrong. He's holy. And that's why to escape his wrath, we need a perfect payment that only he provides. And Jesus does that in full. Because of Jesus, we don't have to face the wrath of God. Because he died and rose again, we can approach a just and holy God, have all our sin forgiven. Not because of anything we've done, but because of what he has already done. And we can walk in relationship with him. So I think that's a really good point. Like you said, what does Jesus offer me? Because there are so many options, especially in the Hindu religion. I think it's over 30 million gods or something. So tons of options. For Hindu, it could be easy to just add Jesus to the list. But if Christianity is actually true, then he's the only holy God. And that's why we need Jesus to be able to approach him. But that's actually the next question. It might connect to this same discussion. Say a Muslim or a Hindu is interested in Christianity, but they also fear wondering, what do I have to leave behind if I want to become a Christian? Because for me, for my culture, for my family, what it means to be part of my culture is to be Hindu.
Yeah.
Or to be part of my family, it means to be Muslim. Do I have to leave all of that behind if I want this salvation that Jesus offers, if I want to become a Christian?
Yeah, this is a really good question and a really personal one. I think the place that I would start would be, maybe going back to the conversation with Hinduism, is that when we use the word, even when we use the word God or gods, we're kind of talking about different things, And so in that sense, I could agree that there are many gods when what we're talking about with gods is what a Hindu means by God. It's a powerful spiritual being that impacts the world. I believe that there are many of those.
Yeah.
And so for Christians, when we use the word God, we're not talking just about that. We're talking about, we mentioned earlier, the creator of everything. All of those powerful spiritual beings, he's the Lord of them. He's the Lord of Lords. And so with that said, that being who we're talking about, I think it's helpful to start that conversation about what does that mean for my life by seeing that God is it's not just asking to be the center of our lives. He already is the center of everything that exists. And so for us, we get to enter into that. And so with that said, it's kind of maybe the concept of centrality can be helpfully seen in our relationships that we're having, in that without those things that God sets up for us, him setting up a family, him setting up the need to honor our parents, that without God, that doesn't really work. Imagine our parents are what we put them in the shoes of where God should be, right? That would mean that we're relying on our parents for so many things. What does that mean? We're setting ourselves up for disappointment. Our parents aren't God. They can't do everything. They can't ultimately provide for all of our needs. They can't provide for, they're going to mess up. God never messes up. And so it's actually by relying on God, by finding in him everything that we need in our hearts and also in our bodies, when we rely on God, that's how we have the best relationship with our parents. And so
Mm.
that's God's wisdom, and
Yeah.
that's the way that things actually are. And
Hmm.
so where it gets hard is that, people disagree, and we have our cultures and people are set in them. And so the truth is that we have to give up the things that are not rightly oriented towards God. It's
Mm.
kind of moving
Mm.
from order to disorder. And so I don't think anyone has to give up every single thing in their culture in order to become a Christian.
Right.
Because our culture, even in a broken way, they all reflect that we're made in God's image. But some people are going to have to give up more of their culture than other people are.
Yeah.
And that's just the way that it is.
It's
And
true.
so we can take, for example, say like an island nation where there's a lot of violence and cannibalism. And so for for a person in that situation to become a Christian, there will be a bigger shift maybe than in their, outwardly at least say,
Right.
in their practices. I mean, you get the idea. There will be a big shift for them
Sure.
culturally. Whereas for someone, say, who grows up and they are in say they have a Christian family, but they don't believe. And then at some point, then they come to faith. Then it's like, well, there are elements of their lifestyle that they definitely will have to give up, to choose God,
Mm.
to change their practices. For example, to start going to church on Sunday. That would be an
Sure.
element of culture, the way that I live, that shifts. But it
Sure.
would be obviously a lot less. And so it's kind of like we're wanting to submit ourselves to God, we're wanting to follow God, we're wanting to choose God and love God. And so the question is, what does that look like for us?
Mm.
And so it might be easier or it might be harder. But what Jesus says is that it's always going to be worth it. And so
Mm.
he says, come to me, you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest.
Mm.
And so even if we are having difficulties, these external factors, there's going to be spiritual warfare. There's going to be these powerful spirits that are trying to get you to not follow God. It's because they don't like you. And so what we need to do, what we can do, is actually trust God in his plan, that he's able to protect us, that he's
Yeah.
able to be the center of our lives, and that he cares about us.
True.
And so he's going to take care of things. But it might be hard. And Jesus doesn't say otherwise. He
Yeah,
says that
that's
if you're
true.
not willing to follow me instead of anything else, then you're not worthy of me.
Yeah.
And so we can't really say that I'm going to follow you if we're actually willing to go somewhere else, in contrary to where he's saying.
Mm.
And so that's where it's kind of like, what does it mean to become a Christian? His name that we call him is the Lord, meaning that we are his followers.
Yeah.
And to our confession of faith is that Jesus is Lord. And so what does that mean for our lives? It could mean something different for people in different situations, but
Mm.
God is enough and he loves us, and
Yeah.
it's always going to be worth it.
Man, I love that. That's just such the perfect takeaway for this question. God is worth all of it. Makes me think of the parable where Jesus said, a man stumbled into a field and found a buried treasure. So he went and he sold all he had so that he could buy that field. And man, Jesus is that buried treasure. He's worth all of it. And so giving up all we have to be with him is so worth it. He is that treasure. And he's that eternal life. Relationship with God, it's you can't compare it to anything. So I think that's a good point. Just say even if it's not easy, he's so worth it. And to make him Lord means to surrender everything to him. Like if I have a house, it's like he wants to come in and clean every part of my house. So I need to surrender all of it to him. Let him do what he wants with it. Saying like, God, you're a Lord of my life. I surrender everything. Even that dirty closet. I'm not going to go in and try to clean it myself. I need you to come and do that and be Lord of even that dirty closet. So that's what God wants, no matter where you are, no matter what culture you come from, whatever religion your background was in. God wants to be Lord of all of it. He wants to be Lord of your family. And like you said, he's going to help you to love your family better because God designed the family and he cares about that. And he wants to share life with them. If this is actually true, the most loving thing you can do to your family is not to reject it, but to embrace it, give your life to God, and let him use you to reach your family with the truth and transformation of the gospel and the love of God. But he also wants to do that in your school, in your work, in all these places. God wants to be the Lord of your life, and it's so worth it.
Something else that I forgot to mention is what some of those blessings are from the Lord. And it says in, I think, Ephesians, that God has blessed us with every spiritual blessing.
Mm.
He really loves us. He really cares about us. And the impact, the blessing, the worth it, the fact that it's worth it for us to follow Jesus isn't just like it's an investment for our afterlife. It's actually right now included in that.
Mm.
And in the Gospel of John, he teaches that to those who believed in Jesus and who accepted him and believed in his name, Jesus gave them the right to become children of God, to be born of God. And so and that's expounded upon more in Scripture, saying that we're all a family. All of the children of God are brothers and sisters of another. And so it's like there are levels to things, you know.
Yeah.
So what is a child of God? It's like, okay, well, in one sense, there's only one eternally begotten Son of God, Jesus himself. But in another sense, he's actually adopted people into his family. He's made them born of water and spirit to be his children. And then the third level could be he's made everyone. He's made all of us. And so there are different levels to things, but we can actually enter in to become God's children. And so we can receive rewards from him. We can have a new family. Yeah. And it's not to necessarily to say to our family, I mean, we shouldn't tell our family, like, you're not my family anymore. But it's that we actually have a big community just by being a Christian. And that's something that I might not always have realized is, you know, if I feel alone, it's like, oh man, I feel alone. But it's just to realize that if you are a Christian, then actually so many people in the world are your brothers and sisters. We're all a family together. And it's not fake, it's real, because we've been born of God.
It's true. Amen. That's so encouraging that you're not alone, but you've been saved into a community, a family of faith. And like you said, you're a son or daughter of God. You're a child of God. So yeah, well, that's awesome and worth all of it. So let's kind of bring this conversation kind of full circle. So we talked about faith and how we've kind of developed in that area, asking questions, talk about certain apologetics arguments, and even worldview engagement, engaging friends, maybe even family members who aren't Christian, come from other worldviews or religions. We see there's a good reason to have faith, and we should be prepared to give those reasons. So is apologetics worth it?
Is apologetics worth it?
Well, is it worth even getting intrigued or looking into it?
Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by apologetics. If by apologetics you mean just being a Christian and telling people about, you know, what you believe, then it's of course it's worth it. So to follow the Lord. Something that I have kind of processed through a little bit is, you know, people have their different inclinations, and those are good. You know, God uses our personality differences. True. And not everyone's interested in all of these philosophical arguments and all these different things, and that's okay. Yeah. You know, not every non-Christian is going to be looking for these types of arguments. Sure. And so we can always be, you know, learning more. We can always be critically thinking, pursuing truth, and trying to point people towards goodness. And so in that sense, you know, having a position, defending it, engaging with the world, engaging with other people, I think it's a great way to live.
Yeah, no, I agree. And just like the verse said that you quoted before, just be prepared. Like, you've got hope, you found it. So be prepared to give others for the reason for it. But with gentleness and respect. It's important. But yeah, so that's good. Any closing words of advice related to apologetics or sharing your faith or engaging the faith of others? Any lessons you've learned, just bits of wisdom you'd like to share?
Yeah, it's easy for me to naturally, if I'm not really focusing actually on God, to just almost descend, you know, from looking at God. You know, metaphorically, we can't see God, but from focusing on him and kind of lowering my vision. We were talking a little bit about sight earlier. And so sometimes for me, the arguments, the analyzing different perspectives, that can itself be the wrong focus, you know, because it's not the end itself. God is the focus. And so with that, I guess ways that we can hedge against that would be to prioritize prayer more than those arguments in terms of in our relationships with other people.
Yeah.
That we can actually pray about what does it look like for me to be a good, a loving person
Yeah.
for this person in my life. If we want to if we want to help people come to Christ, then we need to be loving them. And so if we are really focused on what's the best way that I can actually love these people,
Yeah.
the best way that I can love this person, then I think that's a great focus to have.
Yeah.
And so I would, I guess for me, it's important to make sure to keep apologetics supplemental, that it isn't the thing itself.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. Apologetics is a tool. But yeah, you wanna love them, and you love them in truth. But that's not just about what you say, but it's also about the life you're living towards them, like you pointed out earlier. And I think that's really good. All right, lastly, you got one book recommendation for our viewers today. Go.
I'll say Can Science Explain Everything by John Lennox. That's a
yes.
great book. I think the way that he explains things is really clear and brilliant. And so he kind of gets into the whole idea of, we don't need to believe in God because science can explain our universe. And he really gets into a reasonable kind of rebuttal for some of those claims.
That's good. And that's actually our sponsor for the video. No, I'm kidding. But yeah, no, great book. And if definitely want to go read it. It's a short little book. But yeah, just so many great points and even just conversation tools you can use with friends and family. And you should also just go and look him up. Hear him speak over the radio or on videos. Love the guy. But yeah, thanks for this conversation, Peter. It's always a pleasure, and just great we could invite these guys into it to get to hear a little bit about what we've been talking about. Hopefully it was a benefit to you guys. So thanks for watching. If you like this video, then please share it with someone you think would find it helpful or interesting, and subscribe for more content just like this. Thanks for coming, Peter.
Thanks for having me.